It was almost midnight, the kind of quiet where every small sound feels louder than it should. She was asleep in the guest room, the door slightly open, her breathing slow and even, and I was sitting alone at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I hadn't touched in an hour, realizing I didn't know her real last name. The deadline was less than 8 hours away. By morning, my answer would be final. I had already said yes earlier that week, my mouth moving faster than my instincts, but now doubts were settling in, heavy and unavoidable. Papers were spread in front of me, a pen resting on top like a question mark. I remember thinking how strange it was that someone could be so close, sleeping under the same roof, and still feel like a complete stranger. What I didn't know then was that the reason she needed a husband had nothing to do with love and everything to do with survival. And before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And then if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 6 months earlier, my life had been painfully ordinary. I'm Daniel, 42, divorced, no kids, working a stable job that paid the bills but didn't leave much room for excitement. My days followed a predictable rhythm: morning traffic, polite emails, microwave dinners, and quiet nights that stretched a little too long. That's when I met Emily, not at a bar or through friends, but through a local community volunteer program helping women who had recently relocated to the country. She was 38, soft-spoken, with tired eyes that suggested she hadn't slept well in a long time. She laughed easily, but it never fully reached her face. We talked while sorting donated clothes, and she told me she was trying to start over. I didn't push for details. People carry things. I knew that better than most. Over the next few weeks, our conversations grew longer, more personal. She asked thoughtful questions, remembered small details about my life, and for the first time in years, I felt seen. It wasn't until the 4th week that she told me the truth, or at least part of it. We were sitting in my car after volunteering, rain tapping softly against the windshield, when she said, "I need to ask you something, and you can say no." Her hands were shaking. She explained that her visa was expiring in 2 months. She had fled an abusive marriage back home, one that left her with scars she didn't like to talk about. Going back wasn't an option. "If I return," she said quietly, "I won't survive it." The word hung in the air between us. She told me she needed to get married to stay legally, just on paper, just long enough to stabilize her life. No romance required. No expectations. I remember my first reaction wasn't fear, but disbelief. This was the kind of story you heard about online, not something that landed in your passenger seat on a rainy Tuesday night. I went home that evening and searched the internet for stories like hers. I found forums, articles, and interviews about marriages of necessity, people making impossible choices under impossible timelines. Some stories ended well. Others ended with regret, legal trouble, or emotional damage that lasted years. I didn't sleep much that night. Over the next few weeks, Emily and I talked constantly. She answered my questions patiently, sometimes too patiently, as if she had rehearsed these conversations in her head long before meeting me. She showed me documents, court filings from her previous marriage, proof of the deadline she was facing. Everything checked out, at least on the surface. Still, something felt off, not in a dishonest way, but in a human way. She was holding back. We all do when the truth feels too heavy to hand over all at once. I told myself I was being cautious, responsible. But if I'm honest, part of me liked being needed again. 3 weeks before the deadline, I said yes. I told her I would help. Her reaction wasn't what I expected. She didn't cry or hug me or celebrate. She just closed her eyes, exhaled deeply, and whispered, "Thank you." It sounded less like relief and more like exhaustion. That should have been my first real warning sign. From that point on, everything moved fast. Appointments, paperwork, legal advice. Emily moved into my guest room because it made logistics easier. We agreed on boundaries, rules, an exit plan once things were stable. We even joked about how strange it would be explaining this to people later. But late at night, when the house was quiet, I could feel the weight of what I had agreed to pressing down on me. Have you ever said yes to something that felt right in the moment, only to realize later how much it could change your life? The night before the deadline, the doubts came flooding in. I was sitting at that kitchen table, staring at the papers, replaying every conversation we'd had. I realized there were gaps in her story, small ones, but enough to matter. I didn't know her real last name before her first marriage. I didn't know the full details of how she left her home country. I didn't know who else might be looking for her, or why she sometimes jumped at sudden noises. And yet, I also remembered the way she flinched when someone raised their voice, the way she slept with the light on, the way she once told me. I don't want to be brave anymore. I just want to be safe. The clock on the wall ticked louder with every passing minute. If I backed out now, she would have no time to find another solution. If I went through with it, there was no undoing it. What would you have done in that moment, knowing your choice could save someone or trap you both? At 2:17 a.m., I heard the guest room door open. Emily stood in the hallway, wrapped in a sweater, her face pale. I couldn't sleep, she said. She sat across from me without being invited, her eyes going straight to the papers. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said, "There's something else you should know." My stomach dropped. She told me her real last name, the one she hadn't used in years. She told me her ex-husband wasn't just abusive, he was connected, wealthy, and vindictive. Leaving him had cost her more than her marriage. It had cost her protection. "If he finds me," she said, her voice steady but quiet, "he will take everything from me, including my freedom." That was the turning point. The moment when this stopped being a favor and became something much heavier. I realized then that saying yes wasn't just about helping her stay. It was about stepping into a life I didn't fully understand. We got married the next morning at a small courthouse ceremony. No guests, no smiles for photos, just signatures and nervous glances. In the months that followed, life was tense but strangely calm. Emily kept to herself, worked hard, followed every rule. We lived like polite roommates, slowly learning each other's habits, boundaries, and fears. 6 months later, her legal status was secure. She sat me down one evening and said, "You're free now? I'll start the divorce process." I expected to feel relief. Instead, I felt something close to loss. Helping her had changed me. It reminded me that sometimes doing the right thing doesn't feel heroic. It feels terrifying, uncertain, and deeply human. Emily moved out a few weeks later. We still talk occasionally. She's rebuilding her life, one careful step at a time. I think about that night at the kitchen table more often than I'd like to admit. About how close I came to walking away. About how easily someone's survival can rest in another person's hands. This story isn't about romance. It's about choices, responsibility, and the quiet moments where character is tested without applause or recognition. How would you have felt if you were in Emily's place, watching the clock run out? And how would you live with yourself if you were in mine, knowing that one signature could change 2 lives forever? I had chosen that life on purpose. The farm sat miles away from the nearest town, bordered by old fences and quiet fields that changed color with the seasons. My mornings began before sunrise, the sound of boots on gravel, the familiar weight of routine grounding me in something simple and honest. Feed the animals. Fix whatever broke the night before. Drink coffee while the world slowly woke up. There was comfort in knowing exactly how the day would unfold. No surprises. No raised voices. After my divorce, I learned to value silence the way some people value company. Silence meant safety. It meant nothing bad was about to happen. I told myself I didn't need much to be content. A roof that didn't leak, work that made sense, evenings that ended the same way they began. Chaos belonged to my past, and I was careful not to invite it back in. That was the promise I kept to myself every day, until the afternoon it broke without warning. It was just afternoon when the sound of an engine cut through the stillness, sharp and out of place. I looked up from repairing a fence and saw a black luxury SUV rolling slowly down the dirt road, tires kicking up dust that hung in the air long after it stopped. No one with that kind of car ever came out here. The door opened, and a woman stepped out, dressed too neatly for a farm, her posture tense like she'd rehearsed this moment and still wasn't ready. She stood there for a second, scanning the property, as if confirming she was truly alone with me. I remember wiping my hands on my jeans, feeling the shift before a word was spoken. She walked closer, her voice controlled but urgent, and said my name like it mattered. The contrast was impossible to ignore. My quiet, predictable world on one side, her restless energy on the other, carrying something heavy she hadn't yet set down. She didn't ask for directions. She didn't comment on the farm or make small talk. She looked at me and said, "I was told you might be willing to help." There was no hesitation in her eyes, only desperation held tightly in check. In that moment, I felt the same unease I'd felt months earlier at my kitchen table, that sense that life was about to demand something I hadn't planned to give. I didn't know who she really was or how she had found me. All I knew was that the peace I had built so carefully was being interrupted, and whatever she was about to ask would change the shape of my days. I stood there in the dust and silence, listening to my own heartbeat, realizing that some questions don't sound dangerous at first, but answering them can alter everything you thought you were protecting. She took a breath that looked measured, practiced, like someone who had learned how to stay steady even when everything inside was shaking. For a few seconds, she just stood there, hands clasped in front of her, eyes fixed somewhere past my shoulder, as if saying the words directly to me might make them heavier. Then she said it, quietly, without drama, without explanation. "I need a husband by tomorrow." The sentence landed between us and stayed there. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The farm went completely still, no wind, no birds, just the sound of blood rushing in my ears. I remember thinking I must have misheard her, that maybe exhaustion or heat had twisted her words into something impossible. But she didn't repeat herself. She didn't rush to fill the silence either. She let it breathe, because she knew rushing would only make it sound unbelievable. When I finally looked at her face, I understood something important. This wasn't courage. This wasn't confidence. This was control built out of necessity. Her jaw was tight, her shoulders rigid, every part of her body doing the work of holding fear in place so it wouldn't spill out at the wrong moment. People think desperation looks loud, messy, emotional. Hers didn't. Hers was calm because it had to be. Because panic wouldn't help her now. She wasn't standing in front of me because I was special or kind or heroic. She was there because she had run out of options and time had become her enemy. And as I stood there trying to form a question that made sense, one truth settled in quietly, heavier than the rest. She wasn't running toward something. She was running out of time. She didn't start at the beginning. People rarely do when the truth is complicated and the clock is unforgiving. She told me only what she thought I needed to know to understand the request, not enough to see the whole picture. She spoke about family land first, a stretch of property that had been in her family for generations, farmland much like my own, passed quietly from one name to the next. Years ago, when her father was still alive, a legal clause had been added during a dispute with distant relatives. If she wasn't legally married by a specific date, the land would transfer out of her control permanently. She said it had seemed harmless at the time, something far away, something they believed they would fix later. Later had arrived faster than anyone expected. Her voice stayed even as she explained it, but her hands betrayed her, fingers pressing together, then releasing, over and over, like she was holding herself in place. She told me about a promise made long ago, one she hadn't fully understood when she agreed to it. A promise to protect what her family had built, to not let it disappear because of inaction or fear. She said breaking that promise felt like erasing her parents all over again. I noticed the way she avoided certain words, how she skipped over years instead of days, how she spoke in clean lines when life is usually messy. There were pauses where something clearly wanted to be said but wasn't. Names left out. Places vaguely described. I didn't interrupt her. Not because I understood everything, but because I could tell this explanation was already costing her more than she wanted to give. Silence, in that moment, felt safer than questions. As she spoke, I became aware of how carefully she was watching me, measuring my reactions without being obvious about it. Every slight shift in my posture seemed to matter. When I frowned, her shoulders stiffened. When I nodded, just once, she exhaled as if she'd been holding her breath. This wasn't a pitch. It was a negotiation with time, and she knew she couldn't afford to lose my attention. She made it clear she wasn't asking for romance, companionship, or a future together. She said the word marriage like it was paperwork, not a feeling. Temporary, clean, controlled. The kind of arrangement adults make when emotion would only complicate things. But beneath that calm explanation was something else, something unspoken, pressing against every sentence. What she didn't say mattered just as much as what she did. She didn't explain why this clause hadn't been challenged legally. She didn't explain why no one else in her life could help her. She didn't explain why her eyes kept drifting toward the road, or why her voice dropped slightly whenever she mentioned deadlines. I could sense there was more tied to this than land or promises, but she wasn't ready to open that door. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe saying it out loud would make it real in a way she wasn't prepared to face. I felt the weight of that restraint, the effort it takes to stay composed when the truth feels dangerous. As she finished, the quiet returned, heavier than before. I realized she had positioned herself carefully in the shade, out of the direct sun, like someone conserving energy. When she finally looked at me directly, there was no expectation in her eyes, only a kind of guarded hope. That was when it became clear to me what this really was. She wasn't asking for love. She wasn't asking to be chosen. She was asking for protection, for shelter inside a legal boundary that might keep everything else from closing in. And as that understanding settled in, I felt the ground shift beneath my feet, because protection, once offered, is never as simple as it sounds. She went on only after I nodded, as if permission mattered. This time her voice tightened, not louder, just thinner, stretched by what it was carrying. If she failed, she wouldn't just lose the land. That was the part people understood easily: property, money, documents. What she would really lose was her family's last anchor. The home where she grew up, the place her parents were buried nearby, the name tied to that soil for decades. Once it was gone, there would be no buying it back, no appeal, no second chance. It would be absorbed, renamed, and stripped of its history. She said it plainly, without tears, but her eyes stayed fixed on the ground, as if looking at me might make the loss feel closer. This wasn't about comfort or lifestyle. It was about erasure. About waking up one day and realizing the proof that her family existed had been signed away because she ran out of time. Then she mentioned him. Just once. A single name, spoken carefully, like a fragile object that could break if dropped. She didn't explain who he was in detail, only that he had been waiting for this moment longer than she had. A distant relative, legally speaking, but close enough to know every weakness in the agreement. Close enough to benefit from her failure. I watched her swallow hard after saying the name, her hand tightening around the strap of her bag. Even without the details, I understood enough. This wasn't a neutral process. Someone stood to gain from her losing everything, and that someone was already counting the hours. The deadline wasn't symbolic. It was final. Once the clock ran out, the transfer would be automatic, clean, and irreversible. She explained that she had tried everything else. Appeals, extensions, conversations that ended with polite apologies and closed doors. Every option led back to the same line in the document, written years ago by people who never imagined the consequences would land on one person's shoulders. As she spoke, I noticed how often she checked her watch, how her sentences shortened when time came up, how urgency shaped every word. This wasn't fear of inconvenience. This was fear of being pushed out of her own life, of watching something sacred become someone else's asset. When she finished, the air felt heavier, like a storm waiting without clouds. I realized then that she hadn't come to convince me. She had come to tell me the cost of saying no. And when she repeated that name softly, almost to herself, I could tell that even speaking it scared her, because names carry power when the person attached to them is already preparing to take everything you have left. That I didn't answer her right away because the argument had already started inside me. Every practical instinct I had was listing reasons to walk away. The risk was obvious. Legal consequences I didn't fully understand. The kind of reputation damage that doesn't show up immediately, but follows you quietly for years. I imagined explaining this to friends, to neighbors, to anyone who might look at me differently once the word marriage was attached to my name again. I thought about the emotional cost too, about what happens when you let someone step into your life under pressure, when the foundation is urgency instead of choice. Fear kept tapping me on the shoulder, reminding me how carefully I had built my solitude, how hard I had worked to keep my life simple and untouched by chaos. And then, without warning, I was back in my childhood kitchen, watching my father fix a broken chair instead of throwing it away. He used to say that walking away is easy, but staying costs something, and that cost is where character lives. My mother believed in quiet responsibility, in doing the right thing even when no one was watching, especially when no one was watching. I grew up in a house where promises were treated like contracts with yourself. You didn't make them lightly, but once you did, you honored them because someone else was counting on you. Standing there on the farm, listening to the wind move through the fields, I understood why saying no felt heavier than it should. It wasn't just her situation pressing on me. It was the values I carried, the ones that had shaped every decision I'd made when life tested me before. That's when the truth settled in, clear and uncomfortable. I realized she didn't come because I was the best option. She came because I was the safest one. I wasn't powerful or connected. I wasn't ambitious or unpredictable. I was stable, quiet, unlikely to exploit her desperation or demand something in return. That realization didn't make the decision easier, but it made it honest. This wasn't about rescuing someone or playing a role. It was about whether I could live with myself if I turned away from a person who had chosen safety over hope because she had no time left for either. And as that thought took root, fear didn't disappear, but it stopped being the loudest voice in the room. When I finally spoke, it wasn't a promise. It was a condition. I told her if this was going to happen, she would have to live at my place. Not because I wanted closeness, and certainly not because I was confusing this with anything romantic. but because I needed clarity and control in a situation that already felt fragile. Shared space meant transparency. It meant no secrets moving in the dark. I laid out boundaries slowly, carefully. Separate rooms. No public performance. No explanations to anyone beyond what was legally required. This was an arrangement, not a story we would tell. She nodded through all of it, barely hesitating, agreeing so quickly it made something tighten in my chest. People who still have options usually ask questions. She didn't. She accepted every condition like someone grateful just to be allowed inside the shelter, no matter the rules. The drive back to the house was quiet. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring out the window, flinching slightly when the tires crunched too loudly on gravel. When we arrived, I unlocked the door and stepped aside to let her in first. The moment the lock clicked behind us, I saw the change in her. Her shoulders tensed, her breathing shifted, shallow and quick, like her body was bracing for something her mind didn't want to name. She scanned the room, noting exits, corners, the distance between doors, details most people never think about. I told her which room was hers, where the bathroom was, where she could leave her things. She thanked me, her voice polite, controlled, but her hands shook when she reached for the light switch. That first night was thick with unspoken tension. We ate a simple dinner in near silence, the clink of cutlery sounding louder than it should have. There was no awkward flirting, no attempt at comfort, just two people sharing space under a temporary agreement neither of us fully understood yet. When it was time to sleep, she hesitated in the hallway, waiting until I had gone to my room before closing her door. Hours later, long after the house had settled into its usual nighttime stillness, I woke to a sound I didn't recognize at first. Soft, broken, coming from the guest room. That night, I heard her crying, and in that moment, I knew whatever fear had brought her here hadn't stayed behind when the door locked. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm neither of us had planned but both seemed to need. We shared meals at the same table, nothing elaborate, just food made out of habit and necessity. Conversation stayed light at first. Weather, work, small observations about the farm, about how early the mornings came and how quickly the evenings cooled. There were long stretches where we didn't speak at all, and somehow that silence didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt earned, safe, the kind of quiet where no one is waiting for the other to perform or explain themselves. I noticed she ate slowly, like someone who had learned not to rush moments that might disappear. She always asked before using anything, even a mug, as if she was careful not to take up more space than she'd been given. Over time, she began to talk more, not about love or the future, but about things that lived closer to the surface. The exhaustion of always being alert. How strange it felt to sleep in a place where no one argued or slammed doors. She told me she hadn't realized how tense her body had been until it started to loosen on its own. I listened, not trying to fix anything, not offering advice that would cheapen what she was trusting me with. There was no physical closeness, no blurred boundaries, just presence, respect, the understanding that intimacy doesn't always need touch to be real. For the first time in a long while, I saw her laugh without immediately checking the room afterward, and I understood that trust was forming quietly, built out of patience and the simple relief of being heard. The outside world didn't crash in all at once. It crept back slowly, through phone calls that came too often and questions that sounded casual but weren't. Lawyers left messages that felt rehearsed. Offices asked for documents that had already been submitted. People wanted clarification, timelines, explanations that never seemed to satisfy them. I could hear the pressure building in Emily's voice whenever she answered the phone, the way her sentences shortened, the way she'd step outside before speaking, as if the walls themselves shouldn't hear what was being discussed. One afternoon, I caught a fragment of a conversation she didn't realize I was close enough to hear. A pause, a sharp inhale, then silence before she said, "No, that won't be necessary." When she hung up, her hands were trembling again, the same way they had on the first day we met. It stopped feeling like paperwork after that. Forms don't watch you. Deadlines don't circle back with new demands. Someone was paying attention, and not in a way that felt neutral. I started noticing unfamiliar cars slowing near the property, phones that went quiet the moment I walked into the room, letters that arrived without clear return addresses. When I asked her directly what was happening, she didn't answer right away. She sat down, pressed her palms flat against the table, and finally told me the part she had been avoiding. That's when I learned why no one else could marry her, why friends had disappeared, why family members had gone quiet. Anyone who stepped too close became visible to the same people waiting for her to fail. And now, by agreeing to help, I wasn't just signing papers. I had placed myself directly in the line of questions she had been running from all along. It happened one evening, late, when the sky was fading to gray and the farm felt heavier than usual. She finally let herself speak fully, the words slow, careful, like she was lowering herself into cold water. There had been betrayal, manipulation, a forced ultimatum set years ago by people who never imagined she would still be fighting for her life decades later. The deadline wasn't hers. She hadn't chosen it. It had been imposed, inked into legal language she couldn't escape, a trap disguised as procedure. Every step she had taken since arriving in this country had been dictated by forces she couldn't confront openly. She told me about the threats, the promises that were broken, the hands that had pushed her into this impossible arrangement. And through it all, her voice never wavered. But her eyes told me the cost had been exhaustion, isolation, and constant fear. When she finished, she looked at me, expecting judgment, expecting refusal, expecting me to turn and leave her to face it alone. There was a pause, long enough that I could hear the tick of the clock, long enough that I realized how quiet the house had become. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She was showing me what survival looked like, and waiting to see if I had it in me to honor that without faltering. I didn't answer immediately. I couldn't. Her story had shifted everything I thought I knew about this arrangement, about risk, about obligation. It had stripped away the simplicity I had relied on, leaving me staring at a reality where walking away wasn't just difficult. It could feel wrong to that moment. I felt the weight of every reason I had to say no pressing down on me. Risk, reputation, emotional cost. I pictured myself walking out the door, leaving her to face the consequences alone, and for a heartbeat, it felt like relief. Freedom. The farm would be quiet again. Life would return to the predictable rhythm I had built and protected for years. And for a second, I almost believed that was the right choice. She would manage, I told myself. She was resourceful, strong. She'd find a way. But when I looked at her across the table, the way her hands fidgeted with the edge of her sleeve, the faint trembling in her jaw, I realized she was already bracing herself for loss. She hadn't counted on me staying. Her posture was rigid, eyes distant, a shield against disappointment she had rehearsed 1,000 times. The emotional distance returned between us, a wall built not from anger, but from necessity. Silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable, the kind that makes you feel every second of your own hesitation. At this point, I still thought I could walk away. I was wrong, because even in that quiet, I understood that leaving wouldn't be relief. It would be a betrayal, not just of her, but of the very part of myself that knew what it meant to stand by someone when it mattered most. The morning of the deadline arrived quietly, almost deceptively so. The sun rose over the fields, soft light spilling across the barn and the fences, and yet, every movement in the house carried weight. Breakfast was made in silence. She moved carefully, folding her clothes, arranging her papers, each motion precise, deliberate, as if rehearsing for a moment she couldn't control. I did the same, checking documents, reviewing schedules, making sure every step of the day had been accounted for. There was no shouting, no frantic pacing, no chaos. The tension didn't need noise to exist. It hung in the air like the thick mist that clung to the ground outside, invisible yet undeniable. And then, as she passed me the last folder I needed to take to the courthouse, she looked at me differently. Not pleading, not desperate, just grateful. Her eyes met mine, steady now, and she said something I hadn't expected. For the first time, she wasn't asking me to save her. She was thanking me for trying. I could feel the exhaustion in her body, the way she had carried the weight of fear for so long. And in that moment, I understood that our arrangement, temporary, fragile, and complicated, had already done what words couldn't capture. It had allowed her to reclaim some control, even if only for a few hours, and somehow, in helping her, I realized that standing by someone isn't always about heroics. Sometimes it's about showing up when no one else will, and letting that presence speak louder than any act of courage could. Be why mid-morning, the decision settled into me the way a weight finally finds its place. I didn't hesitate this time. There was no dramatic gesture, no heroic speech. I simply acknowledged what had been clear all along. Walking away wasn't an option if I wanted to honor more than just the law. It wasn't about romance or fleeting emotion. It was about commitment, the kind of commitment that asks you to stand firm when the world would rather you step aside. I told her quietly that I would see this through with her, that the arrangement would be honored, the paperwork signed, and her safety guaranteed. The words hung in the room, steady and unshakable, and I could see the relief in her posture, the way her shoulders released some of the tension they'd carried for months. The outcome was simple in form, but immense in meaning. We completed the process that afternoon, signatures and official stamps securing what she needed. And while the paperwork made it legal, the real change was invisible, a shift in trust, in understanding, in shared responsibility. Safety was restored, not just in documents, but in the quiet confidence that someone had her back, fully and without judgment. For me, growth came in recognizing what it means to step beyond fear and instinct, to act in alignment with values rather than comfort. For her, the relief was tangible, even if her steps remained cautious. By the time the day ended, a mutual respect had taken root, silent, steady, unshakable, the kind that lasts far beyond deadlines, contracts, or promises made under pressure. When the moment came to decide, I felt the weight of every choice I had avoided pressing down on me. I didn't speak to persuade or to impress. There was no need for dramatics. I simply acknowledged what the quiet of the farm had been telling me for weeks. Commitment wasn't optional here, not if I wanted to honor what was right. It wasn't about love. It wasn't about desire. It was about responsibility. I told her calmly that I would help her see this through, that I would stand by her until the paperwork was complete, and that her safety would no longer be something she had to negotiate alone. There was a stillness after I said it, a pause filled with unspoken understanding, and for the first time in months, her expression softened. The tension she had carried, the constant vigilance, began to ease. By afternoon, the process was complete. Signatures signed, documents filed, legal requirements fulfilled. The arrangement, though temporary and practical, achieved its purpose. But what mattered most wasn't the legal victory. It was the trust that had formed quietly between us, the growth that had come from showing up even when the stakes were terrifying. She moved through the day with a weight lifted from her shoulders, and I realized my own life had changed too. The act of commitment had taught me patience, courage, and empathy in ways I hadn't expected. Respect, once formal and cautious, had transformed into something steady, mutual, and enduring. In that moment, safety was restored, not just in papers or laws, but in the knowledge that we had faced impossible circumstances together and emerged without compromising our integrity.